I think it's a weakness not to apologize. I helped create Trump. There's no doubt about that. The personal, ugly politics. I regret that, and I'm sorry for that. And now we've got a guy in the White House, George. That's all he does.
That was former GOP Congressman Joe Walsh, who is testing the power of an apology there. He's counting on forgiveness from some people who view beating Trump as more important than just about anything else. Walsh announced over the weekend that he's running for president on a single core message, that Donald Trump is unfit for the office he holds. It's an argument made by just one other elected Republican official that we could count. When he was still in the U.S. Senate, Bob Corker of Tennessee claimed that Trump had not displayed the competence for the job he held. He went on to describe the West Wing as an adult daycare facility. Corker retired in 2018. Trump's impulsivity and erratic behavior is now well documented. But not one of the nearly 24 Democrats running for president has made Trump's fitness the central message in his or her campaign. Enter Joe Walsh.
We have someone in the White House who we all know is unfit. Someone who lies virtually every time he opens his mouth. And someone who places his own interest above the nation's interest at every single turn. We cannot afford 4 more years of Donald Trump. No way.
Joining us now, former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here, Nicole.
I started with the apology because I think for a lot of people, I think that's your only way in, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think it's sort of atoning for some of the things that are going to be inconsistent with the kind of voters that you and whatever. So just talk to me about sort of the spirit in which disparaging comments were made about President Obama, about Muslim men.
Absolutely. Look, we were divided before Trump, and you could argue the divide got Trump elected. I went to Washington in 2010, Tea Party guy, going to raise hell, limit government. And Nicole, I got ahead of myself a lot, and I got personal a lot. I wanted to fight about policy and ideas, but I got personal. I got hateful about Barack Obama because I got so into the fight. And it occurred to me after Trump got elected that the demonizing that I did of people led to him, because that's all he does. It's probably been the most difficult thing I've ever said, to apologize for voting for him and to apologize for creating him. Nicole, I don't want to give myself too much credit, but I think I created him because I engaged too much in this personal demonization. And man, that guy lives on that BS.
I guess I want to just nail down, though, when he lost you. Because for me, when he came down the stairs and called all Mexicans rapists and murderers and talked about Megyn Kelly as someone who was bleeding out of her, I mean, I was never available to him as a voter who'd worked for the Bush family. And so why were you even available to him to begin with?
It's a good question. I supported Rand Paul in the primary. Once Trump won the general, I supported him because I didn't like Hillary. I didn't love Trump. I didn't like Trump. He wasn't Hillary. And then when he got elected, Nicole, I tried to do the good Trump, bad Trump thing. Give him a pat on the back when he did something good, attack him when he did something bad. I'm in conservative talk radio. All they want to hear is the Sean Hannity bad. The guy walks on water. And this may sound bad. I didn't pay that much attention to him before he got elected. I thought he was a goof who might hire a couple good people and maybe we'll get a couple good judges. It became clear to me, Nicole, after like 3 or 4 months, every time the guy opens his mouth, he lies. And he lost me for certain at Helsinki when he stood in front of the world and said, I'm with Putin. He's my friend. I don't like my own intelligence community. That was it. And I've never, ever gone back.
What do you think the best and most effective way, because this idea of his fitness
he's nuts.
Well, and I think the truth is that whether people say it disparagingly or affectionately, anyone that comes in contact with him comes away saying he's crazy. But this is a hard story to cover, and it's a hard attack to make. What are sort of your proof points?
He's a psychopath. He lies every time he opens his mouth. He's the biggest narcissist we've ever had in that office, and that's saying a lot, John. I mean, at every turn, Nicole, he's put his own interest ahead of the country's interest. Russia screwed with our election, and like a 5-year-old child, he didn't want that to come out because he didn't want anything to take away from his election. He's done that at every turn. We were attacked. This is, and I'm surprised, maybe I'm naive, I only served 2 years in Congress. I can't believe a bigger Republican hasn't stepped up this year to say it. I think, John, you said it last segment, this guy is a clear and present danger. Nicole, maybe I'm a flawed candidate. I probably am. But my God, nobody else has stood up. This is madness that anybody is even thinking of keeping that child in the White House.
What do you think it says, though, that 85% of Republicans still approve of the job he's doing?
I think his approval is soft. I think there needs to be an alternative. A lot of the polling also shows that 50-some% of Republicans would like to see a primary challenge. There are a lot of Republicans who've left the party. You know that.
Yeah.
We need to bring them back. The slogan of our campaign is be brave. Man, you got to be nuts or be brave to do what I'm doing. But, Nicole, it's a serious slogan in that I believe most every Republican privately believes what I'm saying publicly. They're afraid to say it. I know my former colleagues feel that way.
Well, Bob Corker,
we want them to be brave.
Bob Corker said it, and he said it over and over again, and he developed very close relationships with then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. And he actually held hearings to try to limit Donald Trump's nuclear authority. The first time in American history, I think, that a Republican senator went in and tried to strip some nuclear authority from the chief executive. Why do you think more Republicans aren't willing to do what Bob Corker did, which was to say something and do something?
They're afraid. They're afraid
of what? A mean tweet?
A tweet. A primary challenger, I'm not going to get reelected. And that's palpable in the members that I've spoken to, Nicole. They've also made a bet, and this is disappointing. They think Trump's going to lose in 2020. All these Republicans do. They want him to lose. And so they've told me if we can just, you know what, we'll hang on for 2 years. He's gone. And then everything will be back to normal. It won't.
They have Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. And
absolutely. It will not. This man has done so damn much damage to the party. Young people hate the Republican brand. Women hate the Republican brand. The suburbs hate the Republican brand, all because of Trump.
The most disturbing thing for a lot of people, disaffected Republicans, kind of people that I worked with during my time in the Bush family political organization and McCain, are the questions around race. And some of your past comments suggest that you weren't always sensitive to matters of race. How do you sort of help heal what are, in a lot of people's views, the most dangerous and malignant parts of Trumpism?
I'm obsessed with the issue of race. Look, I'm pretty outspoken. I push the envelope. I've got a podcast with a black radio announcer in Chicago. We do it every week called Uncomfortable Conversations. We talk about racism. I think America is afraid to talk about the issue. Now, sometimes I push the envelope too far, and I have. But I am so excited to lead a dialogue on that, on the issue of race. I work with a black pastor on Chicago's South Side. There's an opportunity here for Republicans to get black votes, but not with this guy in the White House.
Why do you think that you can get farther than the 16 Republicans Data ran against him?
Because I'm gonna hit Donald Trump. I'm gonna punch him in the face every single day.
On TV?
On TV, on the radio. I'm going everywhere. Nicole.
If it doesn't work out, will you vote for the Democrat?
I will never vote for Donald Trump again.
Will you vote for the Democrat?
I don't know. It's the best honest answer I can give you. I don't think so.
But if you think that he's mentally unfit, I mean, I said many months ago that I would vote for any of these candidates. I'll vote for their automobile. And I think the most intellectually honest thing to do, if you really, and I believe that you believe what you're saying, is to say that the best person to beat him will be the nominee of the other major party in this country. So if I don't, I'm gonna try to take down his numbers. I mean, this is a political strategist. I'm gonna try to pull down his numbers. I'm gonna raise attention around his fitness. I'm gonna find the few cats and dogs. Maybe stick Corker in a bus and drive around Iowa. I mean, there are only a handful of people who've made this argument. But if it doesn't work out, I'm gonna throw my weight, my vote, my support, and my radio listeners behind the Democratic nominee.
Trump can't win. So I could
Is that a yes?
Yeah, well, Nicole, it's grab my hand. I could be brought there. I'm moving there. Look, I'm a Tea Party conservative. The Democrats' ideas, many of them scare me.
It's not. But if you believe it's an emergency, it's not about their idea. I mean, pay more in taxes if you can get rid of the crazy. That seems like the more intellectually honest place to go if you believe what you say.
I'm almost there. I am, because that's the fight, and that's a better fight. I'd rather sit down at a table with Elizabeth Warren and talk about free college tuition. This guy is destroying the country. I agree with you. I could be brought there.
Howman.
Congressman, I want to come back to the topic that Nicole raised a second ago and focus on it a little bit more. You know, you've apologized for helping to spawn Trump. You've apologized for going too far.
Yeah.
You know, look, what Nicole said a second ago is true for a lot of people. The fact is the president's a stone cold racist, and so are you. And I can sit here and read off tweets Barack Obama's a Muslim. Barack Obama was born in Kenya. I got tweets here with using the N-word not that long ago. And I think for a lot of people, the notion that anybody who has exhibited, you can apologize for various things.
Yeah.
Apologizing for burping at the table or using the wrong fork with your main course is different from offering some kind of a genuine recognition that not just I said things that are offensive, but I'm a racist. I said racist stuff. There's no way someone who to many African Americans looks like as much a racist as Donald Trump has the moral standing to challenge Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call myself a racist, but I would say, John, I've said racist things on Twitter. There's no doubt about it. And an apology is not enough. When I said Barack Obama was a Muslim, that was a horrible thing to say. And I said it because I was so disgusted with Obama's policy toward Israel that I went a bad, ugly step. The Sandy Hook moms, I took a cheap shot against them 3 years ago because they were suing gun manufacturers, an issue that I disagree with. So I took a bad, cheap shot against them. I've done that. But John, again, context. I've probably sent out 40,000 tweets in the last 6 years. No excuse. You and I could sit down and find 200 to 300 that you'd say, Walsh, what were you thinking? And all I can do is own them and explain them and apologize as sincerely as I can for those that deserve an apology.
I'll just say I think you got a lot of work to do on trying to make a distinction between somehow convincing people I'm not a racist, but I said a lot of racist stuff in public.
Well, but again, that's not fair because we have a short show. You said I said the N-word in a tweet. I did. And I did to make a point because they wanted to change the name of the Washington Redskins, so they said Redskins is the new N-word. That's BS. The Redskins doesn't equate with the N-word. The N-word has a unique, ugly history in this country. To make that point, I wrote down the N-word in a tweet to make the point that it's not nearly what the word Redskins is.
But you get that in combination with calling the president a Muslim, saying that he was born in Kenya, et cetera, that this paints a little bit of a picture here that makes people doubt, again, your moral standing to take on someone whose primary, or at least one of his primary moral failings is his racism, right?
Yeah, and I don't know. Look, here's the thing, and John, maybe you and I disagree with this, and I never did get into the birther stuff. I said Obama was a Muslim. I'll get down on my knees because that was a horrible thing to say. I don't think Trump's a racist. All Trump cares about is himself. I mean, he'll throw out racist stuff, bigoted stuff. If you help him, that's all he cares about. I don't know that Trump's a racist. I know I'm
You don't
not.
know that Trump. What else do you need to know? The racists think he's a racist.
Well, then he's a racist, he's a bigot, he's a xenophobe. He's everything, Nicole, because he will use everything to just simply advance his interests.
I want to get my friend David Jolly in here. He made the decision to leave the Republican Party, and I just want him to get a chance to jump in on this.
David.
Hey, so I guess, Congressman, here would be my question for you, Nicole, and I'll just admit it, and I think a lot of viewers would agree with me when I say this. Thank you, John Heilman. I come down in Heilman's approach to this, Congressman. I find a hard time accepting that you might provide redemption for much less never Trump Republicans, but for the Republican Party in this moment. This is a critical moment where we need somebody to draw a stark contrast with Donald Trump. But to your candidacy and to how we evaluate candidates, you know, Nicole asks, why didn't you know when he came down the elevator and he called Mexicans rapists and criminals? I think one of the hard conversations within the Republican Party is those of us who have decided to leave, those of us who created much more distance between this president and this party than you have, we kind of feel like we made the right decision at the right time. And when Donald Trump is gone, and every Republican that remains silent, and I'm talking about Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, Jeb Bush, all those on stage, right, who remain silent, that is a moment where we get to judge their discernment and their discretion and their own judgment. Because if you're asking to be in the Oval Office, where your judgment has to be in a moment's notice, something the American people can trust, how do we trust your judgment if you weren't saying these things 2 years ago and you're just saying them now when you've decided to run for president?
Hold on a minute, David. Then what do we do with the people who left Trump 2 months after he got elected, or the people who left Trump 6 months after he got elected, or the people like me who left Trump after Helsinki? Do we just say they're not on our side, we don't want their help and their support because they weren't there at the escalator? Is that what you're saying? That doesn't seem fair. It would seem to me, let me finish, David, and then it's all yours.
Sure,
it would seem to me that we would welcome converts at every stage along the way if we think they're genuine. David, if you don't think I'm genuine, then it doesn't matter where I came across. And John Heilman, if you think I'm a racist, then it doesn't matter that I'm challenging Trump. I either convince you that I'm not, and I convince you that I'm genuine, or I'm not. But that's your call.
Go ahead, David.
No, Congressman, to your point, it's not my place to say whether you're being sincere or not. I would say you have a compelling narrative of somebody who said, I've seen the light. And the question is it compelling enough of a narrative to run for president of the United States? Or is it compelling enough of a narrative simply to say within the Republican Party, we've got to have a family meeting and change our brand? Because the party suffers from a brand crisis right now, and whoever emerges in the future can't have the baggage you seem to have in this moment. I think you're going to hear from a lot of voters.
How about somebody in this moment who had, as you've rightly identified, as some baggage and is trying to redeem himself or has moved beyond that baggage? I mean, Trump's voters were my voters. Yeah. Trump's voters are my listeners, and I've moved away from them. I don't know. It's an interesting.
Listen,
the one thing I will give you, Congressman, very quickly, the one thing I will say is going to be very intriguing about your candidacy that we not see from Bill Weld. You are coming from the right. I imagine when it comes to the Flores Agreement, when it comes to the wall, when it comes to Obamacare, all these other issues, you're coming at Trump from the right, where Weld's coming from the middle.
Yeah, Nicole.
I think what is important to get on the record at the earliest point that you can is what are your proof points to your commitment to the cause? Because I think what David is speaking to is for a lot of people who took Trump on when there were 17 Republicans running and he was one of 17, it became more daunting as he emerged. And the kinds of attacks that people who were once in the Republican Party get from the right, from people in positions like yours, are vicious. You're about to get them. So let me just put on my strategist hat. I think that if you really believe in this cause, and I'll come back to this, the intellectually honest place to land after prayer or thought or talk with your family is to say that I'm so committed, I will support Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. I worked for George W. Bush and John McCain. That isn't about their policies. That's about my belief about Donald Trump. And I guess I would ask if you're ready to say today, right now, that you would support Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders to keep Donald Trump from being reelected.
I'm almost there. I can't support Trump. I know you want a better answer than that. But, guys, look, for 2 years, I've been in conservative talk radio. 95% of the people who listen to me love Donald Trump. And I criticize Donald Trump every day. I'm not coming to this game today. Now, maybe running for president is a fairly audacious thing to do, to apologize and try to redeem myself. But David, John, Nicole, how come nobody else has stepped up to make the moral case?
They don't want to get yelled at by the three of us. I hope we can keep having this conversation.
Thank
There's
you.
a lot to talk about. And I'm telling you, I think that if you sort of marshal all the evidence, David Brooks wrote in 2017 about a group of Republican senators leaving a meeting with Trump thinking he displayed the early signs of Alzheimer's. If you look at the reporting just from this trip, if you look at the reporting on the speech last week, the rally where he forgot what he said, I'm not a doctor, but if you really want to make that case and you do the work of putting together all that evidence, it's a very compelling case to Republicans who, I'm old enough to remember, used to care a whole lot about the person who served as our country's commander-in-chief.
And the rule of law and the Constitution.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.